Colombia's forgotten plains. Endless grasslands where the sun scorches the earth and the wind carries only dust and silence. In these desolate lands, hope is a myth. Poverty clings to every home, and violence lurks like a shadow that never fades. Daniel Barrera was born into this silence in 1968. In Guaviare, a territory carved out by conflict, smuggling, and jungle law. His family had little to offer him but survival. His father, a small-time rancher, battled debt and drink. His mother raised her children with quiet resignation, knowing that in Colombia's borderlands, dreams rarely live past childhood. The boy grew up watching two realities. On one side, the simple struggles of peasants, planting, harvesting, praying the rains would come. On the other, the roar of guns and the whisper of contraband, as guerrillas and paramilitaries fought over land, money, and power. To Daniel, this wasn't chaos. This was the natural order of things. Violence wasn't an interruption of life. It was life itself. By the time he was a teenager, Daniel had already learned what most men twice his age couldn't grasp. That in Colombia, survival wasn't about strength, but about adaptability. He sold stolen goods, traded cigarettes, smuggled gasoline across borders. Each deal was a lesson. Each lie, each betrayal, was a map of how the world really worked. Locals began calling him El Loco, the Madman, not because he was insane, but because he didn't fear the things others did. He walked into guerrilla camps without hesitation. He spoke with paramilitary commanders like they were neighbors. He wasn't loyal to any side. He was loyal only to opportunity, and that was his true gift. While others picked sides in Colombia's endless war, Daniel learned how to profit from every side. FARC guerrillas needed money. Paramilitaries needed weapons. Corrupt soldiers needed bribes. Barrera became the bridge, the man who could supply what they lacked, who could move what they couldn't. But before the empire, before the millions, before the name became legend, there was just a boy in the plains. A boy with no future promised to him. A boy watching the world burn and realizing he could either be consumed by the flames or learn to command them. The Colombian state had long abandoned regions like Guaviare. No schools, no hospitals, no justice. In their place, only coca fields thrived, rows of green that promised money, violence, and power. Young Daniel looked at those fields not as crops, but as corridors. Doorways to something larger, darker, limitless. He would never be invisible, not like his father, broken by debt, not like his neighbors, buried nameless in forgotten graves. Daniel Barrera was born into blood and fire, and from that fire, he would rise. Not as a savior, not as a soldier, but as a phantom of war. In the Colombia of the 1980s, cocaine wasn't just a business. It was the bloodstream of a nation unraveling. The old cartels, the Medellin empire of Pablo Escobar, the Cali syndicate, were waging open war with the state. Bombs shook cities, politicians were murdered in daylight, judges blown apart in their cars. But in the forgotten provinces, far from Bogota's headlines, a quieter economy thrived. Smuggling, backdoor trades, survival built on whatever could be moved across a border. This was the world where Daniel Barrera sharpened his craft. What began with stolen gasoline and contraband cigarettes quickly evolved. He had the courage or madness to walk where others wouldn't. Guerrilla checkpoints? He negotiated. Paramilitary roadblocks? He paid or played them against each other. Soldiers who demanded bribes found themselves outmaneuvered by a boy who spoke their language better than they did. Every risk he took, every deal he cut, fed his reputation. By his 20s, El Loco was no longer just another hustler. He had transformed into a broker of shadows, a man who could move anything through the chaos of Colombia's endless civil war. Cocaine was becoming the real currency of the land, and Barrera was ready. He didn't need laboratories of his own. Instead, he became indispensable to those who did. Farmers needed protection to grow coca. FARC guerrillas needed fuel, guns, medicine. Paramilitaries needed their own pipelines of cash. Daniel Barrera provided it all and took his cut. What made him dangerous wasn't just ambition. It was unpredictability. You couldn't buy his loyalty because he had none. One day he worked for the guerrillas. The next he supplied their enemies. Betrayal wasn't personal to him. It was business. And in a war where everyone swore allegiance to some cause, El Loco's only cause was profit. That made him both feared and tolerated. Too slippery to trust, too valuable to kill. And as the titans of Colombia's cocaine industry fell, Escobar shot dead on a Medellin rooftop, the Rodriguez Orejuela brothers of Cali dragged into courtrooms. Daniel Barrera remained. He had no empire to topple, no flashy mansion to raid. He moved through jungles, through border towns, through whispers, invisible, replaceable, untouchable. His rise wasn't a coronation, it was a slow infection, spreading into every crevice of Colombia's underworld. By the end of the decade, his fingerprints were on everything. Shipments that left the Amazon by river, planes that crossed into Venezuela, caravans that disappeared into the Andes, and the whispers grew louder. Who was this man no one could catch? Who was this ghost who sold to everyone and bowed to no one? The answer was simple. He was Daniel Barrera, El Loco. Not a king, not a soldier. A phantom too unpredictable to control and too useful to ignore. The fall of Pablo Escobar in 1993 left Colombia in pieces. The Medellin cartel was shattered, its leaders dead or imprisoned, its empire reduced to ashes. Not long after, the Cali cartel, the so-called gentlemen of cocaine, collapsed under the weight of U.S. indictments and Colombian police raids. Two titans gone in less than a decade. For many, it seemed like the cocaine era had ended. But Colombia doesn't erase its ghosts. When one empire falls, another always rises. The cocaine fields still bloomed, the rivers still carried shipments, and the hunger of the North, the insatiable appetite of the United States and Europe, remained. In the vacuum left behind, hundreds of smaller traffickers scrambled for power. Most fought. Most died. But Daniel Barrera chose another path. El Loco never wanted the crown. He didn't need gold chains, mansions, or the spotlight. He wanted the roads, the corridors, the arteries that moved cocaine from the depths of the Colombian jungle to the veins of the world. While other men wasted blood over titles, Barrera built networks. His genius wasn't to dominate the trade. It was to connect it. By the mid-1990s, he was the invisible architect of a new system. Cocaine labs deep in Guaviare, Meta, and Vichada turned jungle leaves into white powder. From there, Barrera's corridors stretched like veins through the continent. Planes slipping into Venezuela, speedboats racing north through the Caribbean, trucks crossing borders with military precision. He didn't just move cocaine, he industrialized it, and his reach was unmatched. FARC guerrillas controlled the coca fields, taxing farmers and protecting production. Paramilitary death squads guarded routes and silenced rivals. Corrupt soldiers ensured the state looked the other way. Daniel Barrera dealt with them all. He didn't wear colors. He didn't raise flags. To one side, he was a supplier. To the other, a financier. To both, a man who could make problems disappear. This neutrality made him indispensable and untouchable. Rival cartels couldn't cut him out because he wasn't competing for their thrones. Governments couldn't track him because he had no empire to display. His face rarely appeared in photographs. To the outside world, he was a rumor, a ghost whispered about in backrooms and jungle camps. But his power was real. Billions of dollars in cocaine moved through his hands. Tons of product flowed each year, hidden in shipping containers, smuggled in cattle trucks, flown across borders in small planes with pilots paid in cash and silence. And while others carved their names into Colombian history with bombs and massacres, Barrera carved his into the arteries of global trade. He turned war into commerce, enemies into clients, chaos into profit. And as the world celebrated the death of Escobar and the fall of Cali, a new reality was already in motion. The cocaine wars hadn't ended. They had simply changed shape. In the shadows of the jungle, in the silence of forgotten towns, one man was quietly replacing the kings with corridors. His name was Daniel Barrera, and his war was not for crowns, but for control of the bloodstream of the world. Colombia's war was never simple. It wasn't just government against rebels or paramilitaries against guerrillas. It was a maze of shifting alliances, betrayals, and hidden agendas. Every village, every jungle path, every river crossing was claimed by someone. and contested by someone else. Most men were forced to choose a side. But Daniel Barrera was not most men. El Loco dealt with everyone. To the FARC guerrillas, he was a trusted partner. They controlled the coca fields, taxing farmers and protecting crops. Barrera bought their paste, processed it, and turned it into cocaine ready for export. He paid them in cash, in fuel, in medicine, sometimes in weapons. To the guerrillas, he was a lifeline. But when paramilitary commanders demanded his services, Barrera never hesitated. He sold to them too, sometimes from the very same batch. The same routes guarded by FARC soldiers one week were protected by paramilitary gunmen the next. El Loco didn't flinch at the contradiction. Loyalty was for fools. Business was for survivors. Even the Colombian military was not beyond his reach. Corrupt officers on dusty outposts found themselves on Barrera's payroll. A crate of weapons went missing. A convoy passed through a checkpoint unchecked. Somewhere in the middle, Daniel Barrera's money changed hands. He didn't fight the system. He fed it, on every side. This was his genius. He made himself indispensable to everyone, even to his enemies. He was the rare figure in Colombia's endless war who could speak to guerrillas in the morning, paramilitaries at night, and government officials by dawn. And none of them could afford to eliminate him, because eliminating him meant cutting off their own supply. Ruthless pragmatism defined him. He didn't see ideology, only opportunity. Where others drew battle lines, Barrera saw corridors. Where others counted loyalty, he counted profits. To him, war was not tragedy. War was infrastructure. And he built his empire on its foundations. By the early 2000s, this strategy made him untouchable. Guerrillas might burn towns, paramilitaries might massacre villages, but neither could touch the one man who kept their coffers full. His product flowed to Mexico, to the Caribbean, to Europe. And every side, no matter how opposed, drank from the same poisoned river. To the world, Daniel Barrera remained invisible. No bombings, no television interviews, no vanity displays. But in the jungles and in the shadows of Colombia, his name carried a different kind of fear. He wasn't just another narco. He was the man who could empower your enemy while keeping you alive. El Loco played all sides because he knew the truth. In Colombia, sides were temporary, but business was eternal. And so he became the dealer of all sides, a phantom who answered only to cash, a man who turned the blood of a nation into his balance sheet. By the dawn of the new millennium, whole regions of Colombia no longer answered to Bogotá. They answered to shadows, villages deep in the Llanos Orientales, towns carved into the jungles of Meta and Guaviare. Entire provinces lived not off government programs or legal crops, but off the coca leaf. It was the only harvest that mattered, and behind that harvest was a name most locals never saw, but always whispered: Daniel Barrera. The coca fields stretched endlessly, green waves rolling across the horizon like a sea that never ended. Farmers bent their backs in the blistering heat, scraping resin from leaves, boiling it into paste. Children carried sacks heavier than themselves. Men with rifles stood watch at the edges of the fields. For every kilogram of paste, someone paid protection. And in the end, all roads led back to Barrera. He didn't rule with armies. He didn't need to. His power was quieter, but far more absolute. In regions abandoned by the state, El Loco was the provider. He bought the paste when no one else would. He paid farmers in cash, far more than corn or yucca could ever bring. He delivered medicine, gasoline, and school supplies when governments offered nothing. To the poor, he was a phantom benefactor, the man who made survival possible. But survival had a price. With every shipment that left the jungle, violence followed. Guerrillas taxed, paramilitaries extorted, police took bribes, soldiers vanished into corruption. Those who resisted were erased. A leader who spoke against coca one week was buried the next. A mayor who refused Barrera's money found his town in flames. People learned quickly. In a land ruled by smoke, dissent meant disappearance. Fear became the atmosphere itself. Entire families vanished into mass graves. Buses were stopped on rural roads. Passengers dragged out, executed as warnings. Farmers who tried to switch crops woke to find their fields torched. For every paved road or rebuilt school, there were dozens of funerals no one dared to attend. And yet, the machine kept turning. Cocaine money seeped into everything. Shops, churches, even local politics. Weddings were paid for with narco cash. Priests blessed traffickers in hushed ceremonies. Elections were decided not by votes, but by which candidate El Loco quietly backed. In these forgotten corners, Barrera was more than a trafficker. He was the system itself, invisible but undeniable. His corridors shaped life and death. His trade built houses, bought loyalty, and buried enemies. He didn't need statues or corridos sung in his honor. His power was felt in every bag of rice sold at a village store, every motorcycle bought by a farmer, every coffin lowered into the soil. To the outside world, Colombia was at war. To those inside the smoke, the war had already been lost. And its quiet victor was a ghost, a man named Daniel Barrera. He had no throne, no crown, no borders. Yet he ruled a nation built on fear and fed by an endless sea of green. By the early 2000s, Daniel Barrera was no longer just a trafficker. He had become a phantom, seen everywhere, captured nowhere. His fingerprints touched every kilo of cocaine moving north, yet his face was absent from police files. To the Colombian state, he was a ghost too slippery to pin down. To the DEA, he was a target too vital to ignore. Operations were launched again and again. Commandos swept through jungles in Meta, raiding hidden labs said to belong to him. They found coca paste, weapons, and terrified workers, but never Barrera. Rumors said he had left just hours earlier, warned by corrupt officers on his payroll. Other times, locals whispered he had never been there at all, that El Loco could vanish into the trees like smoke. Safe houses in Villavicencio, Bogota, even Caracas were raided in coordinated strikes. Helicopters thundered overhead, doors were kicked down, suspects dragged out in chains. But when the dust cleared, Barrera was gone. He traveled light, he trusted no one for long, and he never slept in the same bed twice. For investigators, it was like chasing a shadow through a hall of mirrors. The DEA dedicated entire task forces to him. They tracked phone calls, intercepted radios, traced bank accounts. Still nothing. Barrera used disposable phones, coded language, and human couriers who vanished into the chaos of Colombia's underworld. Every time the Americans thought they had him cornered, the trail went cold. Venezuelan intelligence joined the hunt, pressured by Washington to close their borders to his operations. Yet Venezuela became one of his safest havens. Corruption was currency, and Barrera paid generously. Generals looked the other way. Police commanders issued false IDs. A man who should have been the most wanted fugitive in South America moved freely through its cities, sipping coffee in public cafes, invisible in plain sight. Colombian officials grew desperate. They plastered his face on wanted posters, raised the bounty on his head, declared him the last great trafficker of his generation. But money couldn't buy betrayal. Even among killers and thieves, loyalty to El Loco was absolute, not born from respect, but from fear. Those who sold him out ended up mutilated in ditches. Those who stayed quiet survived. And so the manhunt dragged on. For a decade, every agency with resources hunted him. He slipped through ambushes. He ghosted through checkpoints. He dissolved into jungles where helicopters could not follow. Each escape only added to his myth, each failure reinforcing the idea that Daniel Barrera was untouchable. Everyone chased him. No one caught him. And in the silence of those failed operations, one truth grew clear. You don't hunt a phantom. You wait for it to reveal itself. 2021. After decades of blood and billions in cocaine, the man the world called El Loco was still free. For years, he had mocked the state, slipped past armies, and turned borders into open doors. But every ghost eventually leaves a trace. And for Daniel Barrera, the end began not in Colombia, but across the border in Venezuela. By then, his empire stretched across continents. Tons of cocaine left the jungles of Colombia under his command, moving through rivers, trucks, and clandestine airstrips. Mexican cartels waited to receive his shipments. European mafias wired him millions. Corrupt officials on both sides of the border shielded him from justice. Barrera believed he was untouchable, and for a long time he was. But the net was closing. The DEA, Colombian intelligence, and Venezuelan security services, three agencies that rarely worked in harmony, quietly formed an alliance. Satellites tracked phone signals, informants were planted, money trails were followed. Barrera's strength had always been his ability to play every side. Ironically, it would be his undoing. The very networks that once protected him began leaking information. In September 2012, whispers reached Bogotá. Barrera was hiding in San Cristobal, Venezuela, a city just across the Colombian border. He felt safe there. Corrupt officers shielded him, and the chaos of the region gave him cover. He walked the streets like a man invisible, believing no one would dare touch him on Venezuelan soil. But this time, they were waiting. Venezuelan intelligence agents, tipped off by Colombian and American counterparts, moved in. Streets were blocked, safe houses surrounded. Inside one nondescript building, Barrera sat, unaware that decades of running had finally led him into a cage. The arrest was almost anticlimactic. No gunfire, no explosions, no heroic last stand. The man who had outmaneuvered governments for years was dragged out in handcuffs, his face stunned, almost confused, as if he couldn't believe the world had finally caught him. For Colombia, it was a victory. For the DEA, it was proof that persistence pays. For Venezuela, it was a chance to claim they had done what no one else could. But for the people who had lived under his shadow, the farmers, the villagers, the survivors of massacres, it was something different. It was the end of a ghost story that had haunted them for decades. In that moment, Daniel Barrera was no longer invisible. He was just a man, tired, defeated, shackled. The phantom of Colombia's cocaine wars had finally been cornered, and this time, there would be no escape. Chains rattled against cold metal as Daniel Barrera was escorted onto the plane bound for the United States. For a man who had slipped through jungles, disappeared into border towns, and outsmarted armies, the feeling was unfamiliar. He was no longer the untouchable El Loco, the phantom of Colombia's cocaine wars. He was just a prisoner, surrounded by guards who would not be bribed, threatened, or deceived. The flight itself was quiet, almost surreal. Barrera sat in silence, watching the clouds drift past the windows as if the world he had dominated, the rivers, the coca fields, the corridors of smuggling, had been replaced by endless blue sky. For decades, he had operated above the law, bending nations to his will. Now, he was under the full weight of it. And the irony was not lost on him. The empire he had built through violence and cunning had failed to protect him from a courtroom. Once in the United States, the legal machinery moved quickly. Prosecutors laid out a case that seemed almost cinematic in scope. Hundreds of murders, multi-ton cocaine shipments, corruption reaching high into governments, and billions in illicit profits. Witnesses testified about massacres in Colombia, fields destroyed by paramilitary violence, and towns held hostage by fear. Evidence detailed his role in shaping war into commerce, blood into business. Barrera sat stoically, listening to the world describe the myth he had created, now reduced to words on paper. In court, he became both legend and cautionary tale. Journalists painted him as a mastermind, law enforcement as a monster. To the public, he was the embodiment of the chaos that had plagued Colombia for decades. But inside the fortress of justice, he was no longer El Loco. He was just a man, stripped of power, untouchable no more. Each story told of his crimes added weight to the silence that would define the rest of his life. He was sentenced to spend his days inside one of the most secure prisons in the world. No windows, no visitors, no communication with the outside. The corridors were silent except for the footsteps of guards. He could not walk through walls as he had so often done before. The empire of fear, money, and influence he had commanded for decades was now nothing but memories, distant echoes of a past life. Yet the myth persisted. In Colombia, in the corridors of smuggling, and in whispered stories, his legend lived on. Routes remained. Networks endured. Young traffickers studied his methods, hoping to replicate the success of the man who had once slipped past everyone. Barrera's physical presence had been neutralized, but the blueprint he left behind continued to shape the cocaine trade. Sent to the US in chains, Daniel Barrera became a silent ghost. The man who once commanded armies, bribed governments, and moved billions in cocaine now spent his days in isolation. A courtroom had documented his life, and the world had judged it. And today, he rots in a cell. Even behind bars, the shadow of Daniel Barrera stretches far beyond the concrete walls that contain him. The man who once moved cocaine across continents, who commanded guerrillas, paramilitaries, and corrupt officials alike, may be silent, but the empire he helped build is anything but. The routes he carved through Colombia, Venezuela, and beyond remain alive. Trucks still cross rivers where his convoys once ran. Airstrips hidden in jungles still receive planes laden with product, just as they did when El Loco was at the helm. The coca fields continue to bloom, green waves undulating under the sun, untouched by decades of intervention. Farmers still plant, harvest, and process, living in a rhythm dictated not by the state, but by the market that Barrera perfected. The crops feed not only those who work the fields, but fuel a chain of violence and profit that stretches from the jungles to the cities of North America and Europe. His blueprint for business endures, replicated by younger traffickers who study his methods like textbooks. Violence, too, remains. Barrera's wars may have been personal once, but they became systemic. Paramilitary skirmishes, guerrilla conflicts, and cartel rivalries continue in echoes of the strategies he perfected. Towns that once suffered under his reign still tremble under the weight of lawlessness. Communities rebuilt after massacres remain haunted by the knowledge that the system that allowed Barrera to thrive was never dismantled. It only evolved. Even in death, or at least in disappearance from power, he teaches a lesson that governments often ignore: that fear, greed, and cunning are more enduring than any single man. He demonstrated that war can be industrialized, that chaos can be monetized, and that control does not require a crown or a throne. Barrera's true legacy is not the tons of cocaine, the corpses, or the wealth. His legacy is the infrastructure of fear and profit that outlives him, that continues to shape a region decades later. Young traffickers still whisper his name. In back rooms, in jungle camps, in small towns, along smuggling routes, they speak of El Loco not just with respect, but with fear. He became a blueprint, a shadow teacher showing how to turn disorder into domination. Every shipment, every bribe, every alliance built after him carries a trace of his method, his mindset, his ruthless pragmatism. The man is gone from the world's stage, locked away, silenced, stripped of power. But the systems he created endure. Colombia's forgotten plains, the rivers that snake through dense jungles, the villages that survive off coca. They all tell the story. The story of a man who turned war into business, chaos into empire, and fear into legacy. Daniel Barrera is no longer free, but his influence is. The routes remain, the fields remain, the violence remains. And somewhere, in the shadows of Colombia's underworld, the ghost of El Loco still teaches his lessons.